Hello, my name is Hugh Patterson, and I am presenting on behalf of myself and Doctors Richard Griscom and Lauren Collister. The title of our presentation is Peer Review and Complex Language Resources. We are presenting at the Language Documentation and Archiving Conference that's being hosted out of Berlin, but is being held online. Our work together that brought us to do this presentation comes out of our work as editors of the special issue Language Documentation Collections Assessment and Recognition. It's a special collection in the Journal of Open Humanities Data. In that call for that special collection, we asked authors to write about models for peer review. We know, I think, as scholars, as a wide community of scholars, about models such as open review, blind, double blind, triple blind review processes. But we wanted to facilitate a discussion around how peer review and its goals might coexist with the various needs of stakeholders in language resource creation and language resource reuse. Our interest in these is strongly motivated and guided by several works and statements by different scholars. This, for us, one of those major ones is written by Dr. Nick Thieberger, published in 2016, and describes the impact of peer review on job assessment, promotion, and career advancement in the Australian university situation. One of the quotes from their work was, they say, for all researchers, but particularly those in their early and mid-career, this is a formidable price to pay when track record is measured first and foremost in publications. Thus, it presents a strong disincentive for researchers to continue to annotate, curate, and archive their data beyond the minimum required for their current research focus because of the considerable investment of time and effort required. Basically, we see a disincentive to continue to work on large collections of resources because of their inability to count in job assessment, promotion, and career advancement discussions. So we wanted to recognize that peer review worldwide has different weights. So how it's approached in the United States is different than in Australia, and different again than from Europe, and even within those large regions, institutions may have different peculiarities or specifics in that they're looking for, or how they weight things. We want to say that we wholeheartedly agree that creating complex language resources should be given appropriate weight in these sorts of discussions for hiring, tenure, and promotion. We agree with Dr. Thieberger and his colleagues that these resources do represent a significant amount of time and career investment, and they should receive appropriate value. However, in this presentation, we want to outline 3 ways that we think that we can contribute to positive change in this discussion within our discipline. So I've been using this term complex language resources, but what is a complex language resource? Well, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to say that they are corpora, which are sets of multiple resources brought together for a single purpose, with a design purpose to be utilizable or exploitable as a single resource, right? So there's an intention from the beginning that it's going to be able to be used together as a single resource, even though there are identifiable subcomponents. In contrast to that, there are archival collections, which are brought together, but with a different design. They are not necessarily designed to be exploitable from like a computer perspective as a single resource. They are topically or episodically coherent in that they show a variety of maybe audio or text format or visual formats, but they have a different design component than a corpus. And finally, I want to acknowledge that I think databases fit in here too. Databases often are arranged in have ontologies that inform relationships in them. But we're going to talk mostly today about archival collections and corpora and leave databases for our future discussion. So the three components that we would like to think that we can improve upon the existing discussion, revolve around a distinction between archive versus repository, corpus versus archival collections, and the valuation of complex resources by hiring and tenure boards. So in the first case, archive versus repository, it's important to understand that Thieberger et al., they say this in a footnote on the second page of their paper. They say, in this paper, we use the more generalized term repository to include archives such as the specialist linguistic archives discussed below, meaning in their paper. And so what we see here is a collapsing of the two ideas, one of an archive and one of a repository, and their discussion. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, about drawing that distinction out and how that can actually be helpful in these sorts of discussions. Then the second point there, corpus versus collections, in the Thieberger et al. Paper, they say on the third page of their article, they say, in this paper, we use the terms collection and curated corpora interchangeably to mean a particular type of data set, namely annotated corpora of text data transcribed from recordings that are included in part of the data set. So in this context, I think it's important I'm going to use some library models to kind of help us understand what the difference is between a corpus and an archival collection. And when we understand that difference more clearly, I think then we can give peer reviewers a more objective way to evaluate these resources. So thinking about archive versus repository then, archives have have the liberty and the freedom to grow, wean, and reorganize or redescribe their collections. In archival sciences, we use the terminology accession, deaccession, and curate to talk about those ideas. A repository has a different approach. In a repository, there's a commitment to provide faithful copies of deposits. So the treatment of the contents of a repository is different than the treatment and management of the resources stewarded by an archive. A repository brought out the management philosophy or the idea model of OAIS, and the OAIS model then has been propagated throughout different types of software, and it was founded by NASA. It was developed by NASA as they were working through their instrument data from space exploration and different sorts of engineering projects that they needed then to have a place to put that data and then receive it again exactly as it was. Archives differ from repositories in that they have a tendency to do medium and format transference, whereas a repository is committed to faithful, immutable deposits. So it's a difference in management perspective. Archives are more concerned with preservation, in contrast to repositories being more concerned with persistence. Persistence meaning, will it still be there in 25 years when I need it? So those are some clear differences that are between archives and repositories. And this sets, I think, the context and expectation when we talk about where is the resource and what type of resource are we talking about for peer review. What should if I were a editor sending a peer reviewer a request to peer review something, I would want them to provide objective feedback, but I would want to have objective feedback proportional to the contextual expectation here. So I talked about using some library models. Well, Ferber is a library model for record keeping and describing artifacts that are housed in libraries and archives. And the idea here is this, is that you have a work a general work, and a work then has expressions. Let's say I have a book and a movie that are both about the same, that stem from the same creative work. That would be two separate expressions. Now, perhaps that book is printed in a soft cover, paper-bound edition, and it's also printed in a hardbound edition. That would be two different manifestations of the same expression. And then finally, let's say that your library ordered 3 of each, the paperback and the hardback, for its collections, and it held then 6 items, all of 3 of one manifestation, 2 of another, all of the same work. So that is how this model works. Now, I think we can use this model to help us understand better the difference between collections and corpora. Now, one more thing from the same library science models. Now, the question here is, when do we have a new work and when do we have a derivative work or a descriptive work, the same or the original, right? So on the left side, we have a gray line, and then on the right side, we have a gray line. And in the dotted line in the middle is where librarians generally say, this is time to write, to describe this as a new independent work. So on the left side, an equivalent form, copy, a facsimile, a reprint, exact reproduction, those are all original. They're same manifestation, same expression. Now, the same work, but maybe a different expression of that same work, would be a translation of that work or revision. Maybe if we did an abridged edition or something of that work. Now, free translations are generally have more creative liberties to them, and so they're usually classified as a new work. And then a review or an annotated edition has a descriptive relationship to the original work, but is completely considered a different work or a new work, right? So I think when we look at corpus versus archival collection, the differences here are their internal relationships and their compositions. Now, we could take several different resources out of an archival collection and create a corpus from it. And so a corpus could be a perspective into several resources, but I think at that point, it becomes a new resource in and of itself. If the collector or curator of those things was the same person that did field work, maybe they have a collection and an archive and a corpus, two different things, and should be weighted and counted as such. So we agree with Sullivant here that there's a distinction between a corpus and a collection. And just to describe what he says, he says in his 2000 article that that there's a couple of main points, and I'll read from his paper. He says, speaking about Love, who did a fantastic, Love et al. Published a corpus and did a description of it, and he says that their detailed description of the metadata they tracked for that particular corpus works well for collections of that particular type. But the typical language documentation collection differs significantly from a highly structured linguistic corpus in 2 key ways that ought to be reflected in their descriptions: participant identifiability and granularity of the data access and reuse. Sullivant continues on. The other key difference between corpora and collections is the granularity of the data access and reuse. Corpora are generally designed to be built and to be consulted and reused in aggregate, meaning as a single unit. Users are unlikely to listen to, for example, individual telephone switchboard recordings to hear a particular participant's response to a conversational prompt. In contrast, a heterogeneous and opportunistically collected materials of language documentation collections can and often are consulted individually for their content or for non-linguistic research. So, and the use of these 2 types of structures and 2 types of things is very different. And if we were to ask for peer review of these 2 types of things, I would want, if I were an editor asking for peer review for these types of works, I would want to give my peer reviewers objective criteria for their peer review. And I would expect these kinds of things, because they behave differently, their expectations are different. I would want to give different criteria for each of these two types of things. Now, and when it comes to evaluation of these works, I would suggest that maybe a corpus is more like a monograph in that it's a single work. It's more like a journal article. Maybe it's larger in size and scope and content, but it's more like a single work. And these are other things that peer review boards and tenure boards would be more familiar with. So the other thing would be multiple works. So maybe our scholarly community is well aware of edited volumes or special journal issues. And so a collection could be more analogous to those kinds of things when we come to evaluate the types of resources and having conceptual categories to draw analogies to. The criteria, I think, that would the analysis point is this, is that are these resources mutable or immutable? Are they in an archive or repository? And are they a single work or are they a set of single works? And those are the criteria, I think, that would help peer review boards and peer reviewers and then tenure boards understand those types of resources and evaluate them and give them appropriate weight in those kinds of discussions. So thank you, and we anticipate your questions.